how can we talk about Jesus without looking like an idiot? That is the topic today. And my guest today is Andy Bannister. He's an author, he's an in demand speaker from the UK, and has a new book that came out. The moment it was out, I thought, man, I haven't had Andy on. This is way overdue. Let's talk about this. Andy, thanks for joining me.
Sean, it's a pleasure to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, let's jump into your book. The title is creative, it's fun. But if you're going to talk to people about how to talk about Jesus without looking like an idiot, I'm assuming there's times that you look back and cringe and think, you know what? I was that guy, and I want to warn people from doing what I did. So, can you give
Mm,
us an example
yeah,
of failing to follow the advice that we're about to walk through that comes
yeah.
from your book?
Well, that's very generous of you, Sean, to assume there were times I looked like an idiot rather than whole chunks of my life just being Idiotville, Alabama. So other states are available. I shouldn't cause a gratuitous offence in the South. Where it begins for me, Sean, and actually in a sense I talk about this in the book, is that what part of this book was me writing the book I wish the 20-year-old me had had.
Mm.
So when I was in my 20s, my first job working for a local hospital near where I lived in London, England. And during that time at work, those 6 or 7 years working for the health service here in the
Mm.
UK, where I looked like an idiot was actually I said absolutely nothing. So in one sense, I didn't look like an
Mm.
idiot, but internally I was the idiot because I was so afraid of talking about my faith at work that I
Mm.
said literally nothing. So I ended up living this double life, really, in one sense. That outside work, heavily involved in church, inside work, shut it all away, said nothing, which was just horrific. It
Mm.
was horrific in terms of being a Christian publicly, inside tearing me to pieces. And I look back now, and there were so many things I could have done differently. So that was one aspect of idiocy. The others, I give a couple of examples in the book. I think one of my all-time idiot ones was in my late teens, and I like to say not my fault actually. The youth pastor got it into his head that the best thing to do was to send the youth group. So I was about 16 at the time, out to do street evangelism. So we did terrible drama. I mean, terrible, absolutely horrendous stuff on street corners. So bad that I think one old lady gave us some money to go buy ice creams and shut up. Um, if I met someone of a different faith or no faith, I would usually leap in with my size 10s and say, well, why don't you believe it's obvious? And stuff like this. I wouldn't listen. I would try and reduce my faith to sound bites. And just the whole thing was horrendous. And I think what I was missing looking back then was I tried to make evangelism, on the one hand, this big scary thing. On the other hand, reduce perhaps some of the complex questions out there to sound bites. So in a nutshell, this book is, as I say, is the book that I wish I had had when I was 22 years old.
Well, that's the best kind of book because it comes from a life of experience, certain regrets or things we wish we had do overs on to help people come along and do better than we did. As soon as I saw this book, I thought of a time, and I won't go into depth, where basically I was so emotionally clueless. Right out of
Mm.
college, I took this class on apologetics with JP Moreland and was just ready for a debate, and basically was so clueless that I led this lady to tears, not because of
Oh my.
repentance, but because she was so mad at me. And my buddy was like, "You are so arrogant." And it just rocked me. And I thought,
Yeah.
there's got to be a better way. So that's what I love
Well,
about your book.
yeah. And on that note, by the way, Sean, you make a really important point. I think there are two traps very early on that we can
Mm.
fall into. One is not really knowing anything, and so being either afraid or being clueless. The other is, in your case, and I went through a phase in this a bit later in my life when I went to theological college, that you almost know too much. And so you
Mm.
go out there, loaded for bear, thinking it's your job to take down the next skeptic that comes across your path with the power of your arguments, and you make a complete ass of yourself and you look like an idiot. You make the
Mm.
gospel look bad. You turn people off the faith. Or even worse, you run into someone on the other side who's as combative as you, and you just have a
Mm.
shouting match, and
Mm.
it's just a disaster. So I think, yeah, you can be ill prepared from knowing absolutely nothing as much as you can knowing lots of arguments but having no wisdom.
Fortunately, we don't have to have it all figured out before we have these conversations, and there's some simple things we can all do, which we're about to get to. But I'm curious about the title, and I know titles often come from publishers. It says how to talk about Jesus without looking like an idiot. There, oh,
Yes,
there it is.
there we are. There it
What,
is.
Andy? Why not the title say how to talk about Jesus without being an idiot? Because if we just focus on not being an idiot, then presumably we wouldn't look like an idiot.
Oh gosh, now you see, this is what happens when you start talking to scholars, you see, because we're now debating words and linguistics and should it be this or this. Where this title actually came from, Sean, I was doing a seminar at a conference in Canada. I lived there for 6 years in the mid 2000s, and they wanted me to come and do a session on practical tools for talking about your faith. And I wanted something interesting. I think they wanted to call it practical tools for talking about your faith. I was like, dudes, that is dull. That is like Dullsville, not Alabama. We've done there somewhere else, Louisiana, and so anyway, we brainstormed on the Zoom, and the group of us, about 4 or 5 of us, came up with this title. So and then we tried it out, and it worked really well. That said, you raise a good point. Not looking like or not being an idiot. I think the difference for me is I think one of the things that you can be quite careful. We need to be careful of as Christians is that you can end up condemning yourself. We do it in a number of ways, right? We do it in our everyday walk with Christ. We make a mess up. We stuff up in some way. And if we're not careful, we end up heaping condemnation on us rather than running into the arms of grace and dealing with the issue. And if we mess up in evangelism, I want to say to someone, no, it's not that you're an idiot. You're not an idiot. You're a child of God, someone who bears God's image and God loves dearly. And you've just made a doo-doo, right? You've done something stupid, but it's not irrecoverable. So I think it's important to make that difference between the outward appearance and what it's like on the inside. And by the way, when we talk to those of no faith and other faiths, and I know you've got a wide-ranging audience on your YouTube channel, let's as Christians give the other person the same grace. If you're talking to an atheist who does a bad job of representing atheism, don't assume that they're a bad person, and don't assume, by the way, that's the best argument for atheism just because you've talked to somebody who has articulated it badly. As Christians, let's show the other side grace as well, and realize, there are atheists who are nervous about articulating what they don't believe, as there are Christians articulating what they do. But for us as Christians, to go, let's ensure that it's how we appear to the world that measures up to what we believe on the inside. And even the best of us, right, can look like idiots too.
That is definitely true. Well, great distinction. So before we get into some of your positive steps, maybe you can give us some things you think are unhelpful ways we may be trained to do evangelism, or principles we give that you think, I'm not sure that's the best or the most biblical strategy.
Yeah, that's a great question, Sean. So there's a whole lot of things I think can be unhelpful. Firstly, before we get into the actually how we go about and do it, there's the attitude that we do it in. And I think one mistake that we sometimes make is thinking that we have to, by the power of our arguments and our words, win someone for the gospel just through the sheer, cleverness of what we say or the wondrous nature of our personality. And the problem is, firstly, that ignores this sort of the role of the Holy Spirit. But also it puts this huge pressure onto us that we can never live up to because we weren't intended to. That invariably ends up in disaster. And then people walk away going, well, evangelism is not for me because I tried it once and it ended up in a disaster. And it turns out, well, actually, you just had the wrong expectations. So that's the first thing. I think about our job is to be faithful witnesses to Christ, take an interest in our friends, listen well, converse well, and then trust God to work through that. So go in the right attitude is the first thing. Secondly, I think at times, Sean, we talk too much is a big problem we have as Christians. We think that evangelism is about this little package of information that we go and download onto our friends. We download our arguments. We've sat through or we've read that J.P. Moreland book, and if we could just transfer that onto our friend, and then no wonder people don't want to talk to Christians because we have a reputation for just coming in and yakking at people and not listening. So I think learning to listen as much as we talk can be really, really helpful. So that's a mistake we should avoid. Thirdly, I think related to that, taking people's questions seriously. One of the mistakes I think I made also when I was a younger Christian was I would go to seminars where, somebody would teach us how to share our faith, and there'd be like this 4-step process. And, if you just work through these 4 steps with your friend who's not a Christian, wondrous things will happen. And then you would try it out and your friend would stubbornly not follow the right, would not give the right response at step 2, and it breaks everything and you don't know what to do next. And I think we've forgotten the power of having natural conversations. So making it too formulaic. And last one I'd throw in there are sound bites. And the famous one, right, is giving Jesus as the answer to everything. And that's right, he is the answer to everything. But of course, unless we figured out what the question is, then simply sort of saying, well, Jesus is the answer is a bit of a problem. So those are some obvious mistakes that we can make.
The second one in particular, talking too much, is one I struggle with, which, being a communicator, might not surprise you. My daughter bought me a mug, and Andy, I choose to take it as a compliment. It literally said, I don't need Google. My dad knows everything.
I
So I'm going to take that as she kind of winked and
would
gave it to
take that.
me.
I take that as a compliment.
But you're right. And one of my favorite chapters in the book that we're going to get to is all about the power of a good question, how to ask good questions, learn from Jesus. So that's one of my favorites in your book. We'll get there. Let's talk about some of the other fears that people have. You have a whole chapter
Yes.
on the sum of all fears, and I think you walked through maybe 4 or 5 big fears we all have. I read
Yeah.
that, and I'm like, I'm a PhD. I still have these fears sometimes in sharing my faith. So I'm assuming, like me, they never perfectly go away. So the solution is not to just completely get rid of them, but to act through those
Mm.
kinds of fears. So one of the fear you mentioned is the fear of being called names, being
Yes.
insulted. And that can be online or in person. How do you deal with that fear?
Yeah, I mean, that's a real one, isn't it? Because we live in an age where, I've had friends that's happened to. They've come out as a Christian at work, and before they've even been lit, they've even been heard. Somebody has said, "Oh, you Christians are, homophobic, transphobic, whatever the current sort of adjective sloshing around is," and that can be terrifying. Not least because we're wired as human beings to want to build good relationships with those around us, and so that can force us to self-censor and say nothing. So there's that. Yeah, there's that fear out there.
Hmm.
How do we how do you deal with that? Well, one thing I say straight up in the book in a couple of places, Sean, with every fear, one of the first things to do is actually to actually bring it out into the open. It's sometimes we
Hmm.
sort of hide these away. We don't talk about them. Well, do talk about them. Talk about them with other Christians. Identify that this is an issue for you. The more that I think we look at our fears, sometimes they shrivel a bit like vampires in the
Hmm.
sunlight. If as long as you keep them stuck in the closet, they grow bigger and bigger and bigger. So the first thing is let's actually talk about it. Second thing I think can be really helpful is to realize that actually, 9 times out of 10, the fear doesn't actually materialize. Yes, you might be called a name, but a lot of times you won't be actually, and sometimes the fear can seem bigger than it is. So, be aware of the fear. Talk it through, think it through. Perhaps with
That's
the
great.
friends talk through what might happen if that were to occur. But 9 times out of 10, it doesn't. I think we actually do our skeptical friends a grave injustice if we say, well, look, everybody is not a Christian, is just out there loaded and ready to shoot down the first Christian. But actually, probably like you, I meet lots of folks who don't have a Christian faith who are interested in talking about these
Agreed.
things if we show that we are people who are willing to talk about it carefully. And then the last thing I say, and I think for me this was transformational when the penny dropped for me on this, Sean, is that fear is quite natural. Actually, we have fear in lots of areas of life. Actually, in fact, most of the exciting things we do in life are a bit nerve wracking. I do rock climbing, and however long I've done it, I still find abseiling terrifying. It's not something that is a naturally thing to do, to lean back on a rope and trust somebody at the bottom not to kill you. Um, but I've learned to push
Hmm.
through that for a couple of these reasons. Firstly, because rock climbing is fun, and I think evangelism actually is fun. It's quite exciting sharing our faith, and
Hmm.
maybe most exciting things in life, there's a little bit of terror. They wouldn't be exciting if they weren't. So rather than run away from the fear, go, actually maybe the fear is connected with the fact this is an exciting thing to get involved in. But then secondly, like the rock climbing analogy, with a little bit of training. Once I knew how to, in my early days, how to put on a climbing harness, how to tie in, there's basic things. Go, oh, okay, I know a little bit what I'm doing. And similarly in evangelism, you can learn some basic tools quite simply, actually, that will help you navigate some of this. And then the last analogy, being a preacher, I like analogies, right? From the rock climbing end of things, is why do I not panic? Because I go climbing with people I trust. I trust the person
Hmm.
on the end of the rope. I'm not going to let, any old random person just belay me down the cliff. Well, for Christians, two thoughts there. The ultimate person who's got the end of the rope is Jesus. And the more that we realize that evangelism is his work and he's working through us, but also don't do this stuff alone. If you're going to try and
Hmm.
share your faith with your friends and your colleagues, ideally have another Christian with you or another Christian who knows what you're doing. So you can go and tell them what's happened, tell them the successes, tell them the failures. Don't try and do it alone because that can be lonely, it can be depressing. When I was learning how to be a bit better at sharing my faith in my mid-20s, it was great, hugely important. But I had other older Christians around me who could encourage
That's
me and,
great.
and sort of mentor me a little bit. So don't face this stuff alone.
My experience is very much the same as yours, that people across the political divide, across the religious divide, want to have meaningful conversations on big issues and spiritual things if it's the right setting and we have the right attitude. Most people aren't locked and loaded, ready to insult, although that happens some. But with that said, The
Mm.
message we preach is foolishness to some, we're told. It's a stumbling block. Jesus was called a false prophet. He was
Mm-hmm.
called illegitimate. He was called a drunk. Paul was called a babbler. He was referred to as being insane. So
Yeah.
somehow I know, that we got to keep this in balance, that if you're never called a name by anybody under any circumstances, you might not be sharing the gospel. You might not
Mm.
be bold enough. Although most people won't and they'll listen, it's going to happen. So when those names come, I often ask myself, okay, is it because of my attitude? Am I being a jerk then? Or am I being an idiot? Then maybe I deserve it. Or is it because of the message? Then I'm in good company, because this is what happened to Jesus and happened to
Yeah.
Paul. So I try
I
to
I think
keep
that's
those
really
in
important,
tension.
actually. And very briefly on that, Sean, something that reminded me of that I think is almost ties back to the earlier question about mistakes. One of the other things that, because of this fear, I think particularly being called names and some of the other stuff that goes on. One thing that I think Christians can sometimes do, I caught myself doing this
Hmm.
20 years ago, and I know people still do it today, is you therefore take the strategy of going, okay, to make evangelism as safe as possible, what I'll do is I'll be a nice person. I'll be a nice Christian.
Hmm.
I'll be a nice person at work. I'll be a nice person in my neighborhood. I'll wash up everybody else's coffee cups. I'll serve my colleagues. I'll mentor younger team members. I'll organize the interdepartmental snakes and ladders league. I will be the nicest guy I can. And then people will go, oh, what a good person. Andy, Sean, they're obviously Christians. And the problem is people don't make the connection. People just look and
Hmm.
go, oh, you're a nice person. And that's wonderful. By the way, the takeaway from this is not be a jerk at work. But that's the next book. The takeaway is if you're just a nice person because you're trying
Hmm.
to keep your head down, then actually, ironically, what you do is draw attention to you and not to Jesus.
Hmm.
But if you are that nice person who goes the extra mile, you're the person everyone at work or at university is so pleased that you're in the team or part of the class because of what you bring. That does also at the same time minimize the risk, or there's always a risk, that when you do talk about Jesus, people will at least go, oh, okay, well, all right, yeah, Sean's a bit of a weird religious guy, but he's also the guy who really helped me out when I was in a bind. He's also the person who covered for me on that shift when I couldn't do it. He's also the person who stayed late clearing up everybody else's mess. It does win you a bit of a foot in the door when you do love sacrificially and then you back that up with words.
Hmm. That's great. I remember years ago I had a chance. I was hosting a conference on the Case for Creator book that came out by Lee Strobel,
Oh, yeah.
and I had a chance to interview him. And I'll never forget a line he said. He goes, Sean, this is not a niceness contest. He goes, we need to be kind and care about people, but
Mm,
this is not about who's the nicest. There's a difference between kindness and niceness. So that's
very true.
always stuck with me, because he's one of the best evangelists that I know. How about one
Yeah.
more fear? What about the
One more.
fear
Yeah.
of being asked a question that you don't know the answer to? And before
Yes.
you answer that, you've been an apologist for years. Do you still get asked questions you don't know the answer to?
Right. Yes. To begin on the second half of that, yes, I do. I mean, one of the dangers, right, and you'll be aware of this too. And when the likes of you or I talk about this stuff, people look at us and go, "Well, it's all right for you, Andy. It's all right for you, Sean. You've been doing this for years, and the answer to every question."
That's right.
And of course, we don't. Two things happen to me regularly, and I'm sure you would probably have the same experience. Firstly, is you might genuinely be asked about an area you've never thought about. So I will occasionally get questions on say
Hmm.
Hinduism, very multicultural part of the country I live in here. So questions about other religions come up. Well, look, my academic background is Islamic studies. I feel very confident talking about Islam and the Quran and all this stuff. But if somebody asked me a question about some aspect of Hinduism, and this I had one of these the other month in a seminar I was teaching, I had to go, do you know what? I actually don't know. But
Hmm.
at least in that case, actually, I was able to go, but I know a man who does. I have a friend of mine, Rahil Patel. He used to be a Hindu priest. He's now a Christian last 30
Hmm.
years. If that question matters to you, come and talk to me and I will put you in touch with him and he will be able to hopefully help you. So I regularly get that. Or new versions of old questions. Suffering is an interesting one
Sure.
because when suffering strikes personally, there's always a unique aspect to that story.
Hmm.
And I had one the other month which involved, tragically a double suicide, and that was a variation of that question I never had. Now I knew, and I hate to be, that sounds so cocky when we're dealing with suffering, but I've thought a lot about suffering, but I'd never had to address that particular aspect the way it came up for this person. That was tough. So yes, absolutely, get questions that that I can't answer, or I have to direct to others. And I think it's also important, by the way, when the likes of you or I stand in front of a crowd or on a YouTube video, I think it's actually important that we tell people we can't answer every question, because
Hmm.
otherwise we look really arrogant if we're standing up there going, Andy, Sean, whoever we are, we can answer everything.
Hmm.
I think if I was outside the faith, I would walk away from that. That smells a bit suspicious. Whereas I always like to try and say, I'll do my best. Now, look, you or I have been apologists a long time. For people who are, in the workplace, haven't thought about this stuff, that, yeah, you're right, that fear of being asked a question about science, sexuality, suffering, even a topic that doesn't begin with S, can be quite intimidating. I teach some practical stuff in the book, around some basic tools, again, that we can use. But
Yeah.
where it begins, I think, for people, I would say, is, look, realize that if you don't know the answer to the question, that's okay. It's okay if your colleague asks you, what about God and science? And you don't know. Because what you could say to your colleague is say, that's a really good question. Tell me, by the way, why you asked it, and, dig around it a bit. But
Good.
then say, look, I'm a Christian who likes to be thought through and show my faith as foundations. I haven't thought about that particular question. If it really matters to you, would you mind if I took that away for a wee while, and
That's
I'll
great.
I'll go and do some digging. And do some digging. There are great apologetic websites and resources out there. There's all your stuff, and the Solas website, and many other ministries out there. There are great books out there. Or talk to an older, wiser Christian. If you're a younger person
Hmm.
watching this, talk to your pastor. I mean, ring your pastor up. Trust me, at 3 a.m, he's not doing anything anyway. He's prepared the sermon. He's done all praying. Ring him at 3 a.m. He's bound to have some spare time, and ask him his take on a. I'm going to loads of pastors now writing angry emails in, aren't we? Going, what did Bannister say? And but find the answer,
Hmm.
and then you can go back to your friend, can't you, in a few weeks' time and go, well, thank you for that question you asked the other week. I did some research, and I think I've got an answer. What do you think? And that can be helpful. And one last thought, by the way,
Yeah.
if you're not a thinker or a reader or that kind of person, lots of people listening to that may not be wired this way, Sean. I always say to people, that's absolutely cool, that's fine, but at least be aware of what's out there. If you just know that on God and science, just to be able to know, and a bit of practice you'll get there on this, to know that, say, John Lennox is a good resource.
Yeah.
Because then you can say to someone, look, I'm not a thinker. I'm just not wired that way. But I do know that this guy or this girl are really, really good. Why don't we take a look together? Why don't we pull up one of John's, to use that example, videos or something, and we could watch it together and have a think about it.
That's a great response. I love the idea of continuing the conversation, not feeling the need to have all the answers. Although I'm going to have to ask you to define what you mean by a wee while. I'm not, I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
Well, for listeners to that, I said that, I was like, oh, hello. I lived in Scotland, Sean, for 6 years. I live in England now. And of course, wee is that Gaelic sort of phrase for little, for small, for tiny. And although I'm no longer in Scotland, I've kind of bits of Scottishisms have embedded themselves in my lingo, as have Canadianisms. So I'm unusual here in the UK. I cause confusion by talking about gas and trash and washroom. And
I
now I've
love
added
it.
we to my collection of unique. My lingo must be fairly unique, actually, because I've moved around so much.
Well, tell me about your story. I know that also is unique. What led you to Christ? Would love to hear.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in a Baptist home in South London. You don't have to be a Baptist to go to heaven, Sean, but why take chances? That was my family's motto. So born and raised in a Baptist home, and loved it. I mean, I was, I know some people rebel against this stuff. I loved it. I loved going to church. I loved the youth group. Loved all that kind of stuff. But sometime, I think around about 13 or 14, um, I began figuring out that the faith that I thought I had wasn't my faith. It was my mum and dad's faith. In fact, I'm sure it may be you. You can correct me if
Hmm.
I'm wrong. I'm sure you once told a story of one of your kids. You asking one of your kids the question, "Why do you believe the Bible?" And they said words to the effect of, "Because you and Mum do." I think this was you, or if not, I'm crediting you with someone else's story. And anyway, the answer was, "Well, that's not good enough. You need to have
Hmm.
reasons for your own." And that was me. I was that kid
Hmm.
of suddenly realizing, "Gosh, actually, do I really? Is this faith mine, or am I just hanging on to Mum and Dad?" And I began thinking about that and wondering about it. And then one night, I was at a youth camp, wonderful youth camp on the south coast of England, on the cliffs overlooking the sea. It was a dark and stormy night, though, so I still remember the tent kind of flapping and the rain beating down. And there was a youth preacher there. About 200 of us squashed into this tent, and I can't remember exactly what he said. I wish I had one of those conversion stories where I can remember every detail, but I remember it was the first time where I really realised actually all I had to do was say yes to what I already knew, But
Hmm.
for me, I knew who Jesus was. I knew what Jesus had done. I believed that stuff. And there was an altar call at the end. And I got up and went forward and stuck my
Hmm.
hand up and went, yes, okay, this is now me, Andy, saying yes to Christ, not me saying yes to my mum and dad who said yes to Christ. And then what happened from that point on, typical teenage stuff, lots of questions and stuff would come up at school, friends ask me things, issues, all the kind of ethical challenges that you're faced with as a teenager. And so I wrestled through some of that. There were ups, there were downs, there were days I think I did a good job living for Jesus, days when I let him down badly.
Hmm.
But then a really significant moment for me happened in my early 20s when a friend of mine who was going up to a place in London called Speaker's Corner, part of one of our big
Yeah.
parks in London where you can talk about anything. He was going up there and preaching to Muslims, and he invited me to come along and see what they did.
Hmm.
Well, he said, see what we do. Actually, I went up to London and he brought a spare ladder for me to stand on and speak, and he invited me to stand next to him and preach on the street. I'd never preached on the street before. I never
Wow.
really articulated my faith in public before. And there were Muslims there who were really confident and practiced in taking Christians down. And I got questions and objections, Sean, thrown at me. And just like you asked me a minute ago, I had no idea what to do. And I remember getting down from the ladder and going back home thinking, well, maybe I need to become a Muslim because they seem to have everything and I have nothing. But I think for an
Wow.
wiser friend said, go to what you need is apologetics. And first time
Hmm.
I'd heard that word, and I said, well, what is it? It sounded to me like a breakfast cereal. But they told me what it was, and I went to the local Christian bookstore and I bought my first ever books on answering questions.
Hmm.
C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, a book on Islam, and then, by the way, a book by your dad,
Oh,
Evidence
wow.
of Demands a Verdict. I have a
Wow.
dusty, battered copy of that somewhere in this office. And I read that stuff, and I went back to
Hmm.
Speaker's Corner with answers to some of the questions. They had other questions, and actually, it was Muslim friends over the next 2 or 3 years who really, actually, I don't think meaning to, really helped refine me in terms of beginning to fall in love with giving really good reasons for what I believed, and then one thing led to another. I went off to theological college. So yeah, it started from being raised in a Christian home, having no idea what I believed and why, and then eventually God's led me on this path of just loving thinking through how we talk persuasively about Jesus with those who believe wildly different things.
So, do you ever go back to Speaker's Corner anymore to debate or dialogue, or are you more interested in kind of the conversational approach that you're
Mm.
talking about in the book?
Well, it's funny you say that because I'm always very nervous giving that story in a setting like this because this book is not aimed at people who want to do that. That was my
Hmm.
own personal journey. But interesting you make that point, Sean, that eventually I drifted after about 5 years or so at Speaker's Corner. I stopped going. I've been back a couple of times for old times' sake, but I began to dislike that
Hmm.
very combative, let's shout at one another and have a big
Yeah.
loud to the public. Now, look, there's something in there, and there's a power in that. And certainly one thing is that if for certainly I would find for Muslim friends from say Middle Eastern background, that's much more cultural, and it's much more normal to have those quite heated debates and then embrace afterwards and wander off. But for me, the way I'm wired, I prefer conversation, I prefer dialogue, and so I do events now. I do Christian Muslim dialogues, for example, but I do
That's
dialogues
great.
where we might sit down in a much calmer environment on a stage and talk about a topic. But what I love is more the one-to-one stuff now, where you can sit
Hmm.
down, talk with someone, have a sensible conversation, and think through the big questions of life. But I learned a lot. I'm a great believer in God always uses wherever He's placed you now to be preparing you for the next thing as well. So there were lessons I learned there at Speaker's Corner that I think
That's
are
great.
really, really helpful. But I'm also very conscious that most Christians, that's not their context. What most of us need to learn to do is to talk naturally to our friends, our neighbours, our
Hmm.
colleagues, not stand on ladders and yell over the back fence.
Yeah, I think most Christians shouldn't do that because if you don't do it well, you can do more harm to yourself and to others. But everybody can have a conversation with their friends and their family and neighbors in the right way. Now, I want to know how you keep something in balance. I have a friend who's been on this channel, I think 4 times. He describes himself tongue in cheek as an atheist New York media elite.
Very
So
good.
grew up in the Northeast, writes for leading publications like The Atlantic, New York Times Magazine. And we are having this conversation, and he said, I don't really want you to become an atheist to me. He said, I think he's just intrigued by a
Yeah.
Christian and my worldview. And if you don't believe eternity is at stake, then there's less need to try to persuade somebody. And I tried to communicate to him. I said, I care about you as a friend, whether you ever believe or not, but I'd be disingenuous if I didn't say that I want you to become a Christian because I think eternity is at
Hmm.
stake. So I'm wondering how you balance being in a relationship with people, having spiritual conversations with people, even if they say, you know what, Andy, I'm never going to believe.
Hmm.
Will you still be friends with them, or will you move on to the next target
Yeah.
who will come and believe?
Well, that, Sean, is the crucial piece, isn't it? Because, look, in terms of sharing with our friends, if we feel bad about that in any way, my response to people would always be, look, if you believe that Christianity, that Jesus is the greatest news ever, which is what we do as Christians, then of course you'd want to share that with your friend. In fact, not sharing it with your friends would be either there'd be some weird, do you really believe this going on? Or how much do you not care about your friend not to share it with them? So sharing the most important thing in your life with your friend is quite natural. And by the way, the reverse of that is true. If you are friends with someone who the most passionate thing in their life is, human rights and justice and advocacy, or you're friends with a Muslim for whom the greatest things is Muhammad, Allah, on the Quran, presumably within that friendship, you're going to create space for them to talk about the things they
Yeah.
care about, because that's
Hmm.
natural. It's the first thing. But you've hit the nub, I think, which is, if as Christians we either give the impression, or worse, we actually engage in the activity of, oh, this person is not likely to respond, therefore I'm going to move on, then I'm sorry, I've got very little time for that, because I think that's deeply
Hmm.
hypocritical. I think it's not treating the other person as made in the image of God, and your friendship is really a falsity. So I have huge concerns there. And by the way, you also don't know what's happening in the life of your friends. One of my dear friends, before he died a few years ago, was a guy called Nabil Qureshi. I'm sure you and Nabil probably
Yeah.
crossed paths in your time.
Yep.
Nabil, for those who don't know him, he was a Pakistani Muslim, deeply devoted Muslim. Moves over to the US with his family. Specializes in taking Christians down and being quite sort of difficult with Christians. And then God, when he goes off to college, God ends up putting him. I believe God put him with a roommate, Christian roommate called David Wood, and David is as combative as Nabil was. And thus began a beautiful friendship and a long series of 5 years worth of arguments.
Wow.
But here's the thing: David will tell you that many Christians said to him, "Give up on the bill. Give up. He's not going to become a Christian. You've been at
Wow.
it for a year, 18 months. You've been arguing with him, reasoning with him, engaging with him. He hasn't shifted. He's not going to become a Christian." People would say that to him, and David's answer, bless him, was always, "What on earth are you talking about? He's my friend. I care about him. I like him. I love him. He's my friend. Whatever he believes." Now, the amazing thing is, I think it was 5 years on, Nabil becomes a Christian very, very dramatically. And some of that was David's influence, and some of that was, a couple of dreams where Jesus literally appeared to him, other kind of supernatural goings on. It all came together. But if David had walked away on that friendship, goodness knows what would have happened. But he
That's
stuck
a
it in
great
there.
example.
So yeah, stick it in there with your
Hmm.
friends. And last reason, of course, is you're going to learn things too. If you want to learn how to communicate as a Christian, it's great to have non-Christian friends in your life, like your buddy, who, even though it may seem nothing's shifting, you've probably learned loads from him about how to engage, about how to listen, and so
Hmm.
forth. So yeah, iron can sharpen iron, even when one part of the sharpening isn't necessarily Christian at this point.
So, perhaps my favorite chapter in your book is called The Power of a Good Question. And that's because I think a lot about how to ask good questions. I watch people who are good question askers. I try to get better on this show in my relationships. So, why are questions so powerful? Give me kind of the philosophy behind that approach, and then
Yes.
let's start to unpack what it means to ask a good question.
Well, certainly we might begin, Sean, and we can dig more into this separately, but just throw it right out there right at the start. As Christians, one of the reasons I think questions are a good thing is Jesus used them all the time. If you look at the Gospels, Jesus asks over 300 questions. Questions were his main way of engaging with people. So if we're going to be saying we're going to follow the master, then I think there's something in this. But then we dig into why. We talked earlier about, Christians have this reputation for being people who want to throw information at people and sort of download on folks and just dominate the conversation if we're not careful. Learning to ask questions stops that. It slows it right down. It turns it into a conversation. So questions can be really, really powerful. But then questions, I think, do a couple of other things that are really significant. Questions make the other person do some work. So, for example, if you're
Mm,
engaging with an atheist friend, if you're not careful, it can sometimes turn into a situation where the atheist is asking all the questions and raising all the critique, and you as the Christian are doing all the defending. Or rhetorically, incidentally, that looks weak. If one party is doing all the defending, the other person's always on the attack, that can look like the stronger position is on the skeptical side. But the main thing is your atheist friend is not having to do any work. They're not having to defend what
Hmm.
they believe. They're not even articulating what they believe. So even sometimes when I meet folks who self-identify as atheists, I've learned to, sometimes with a twinkle in my eye, just say, well, this is great. Atheist tells me what you don't believe. What do you believe? What gets you out of bed in the morning? It probably isn't the absence of belief in God. It's probably other things that you care deeply about. What are those things? And then things can become
That's
quite
good.
interesting. And then lastly, Sean, on this point, I think asking questions exposes assumptions, doesn't it? That people bring baggage
Hmm.
into conversations, right? And I think sometimes if we don't name the elephant in the room, that's a mixed metaphor, isn't it? Although maybe it was an elephant with baggage. Um, if we ask questions, we can expose that. One very simple example, I can't recall if I use this in the book or not, but is if someone says to you words to the effect of, well, hang on, how can you be a Christian? How can you believe in a good God when there's all this evil and suffering in the world? You might be daunted by that question. You might think to yourself, oh, I know the answer to this. I listened to a Sean McDowell video. I know what I'm doing. Either of those is not necessarily helpful because you've missed something. You've missed the fact there's a particular person asking it, and there's a reason they're asking it. And so saying to your friend, that's a great question. Tell me, why do you ask it? What is it that
Hmm.
leads you to ask that question?
I love that.
That may well have them say, well, my cousin has just been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, age 36. Right, okay. Now we're dealing with more of a pastoral issue as much as we are an intellectual one. And you'd have
Hmm.
missed that if you'd gone straight for, okay, here's my, I'm going to download answer number 473, or you'd run screaming for the exits
That's
because you didn't
great.
know how to answer. So it slows things down and exposes assumptions. Questions do that.
Jesus asked 339 questions, and we have Paul asking 262. I have a friend who's cataloged all these questions. Now, I was told there's 3,000 questions in the Bible. I haven't gone through and counted. I can't verify that, but sounds reasonable. The thing I often think about is the very God who made our brains chooses to communicate with us through questions. Just look in the garden. So
Yes.
clearly, telling stories and asking questions matches up with the way God has made us to be. Now, when you're asking questions, are you thinking there's kind of the tactical strategy that says, I'm going to recognize the faulty thinking, I'm advancing an argument, I'm clearing away, bad arguments, so to speak? Or there's the questions that are just like, I'm curious and I want to understand.
Mm,
On this channel, sometimes I have one or the other, but oftentimes I just want to understand. I'm curious, trying to get
yes.
inside somebody's mind. Do you do both? Do you favor one or the
Mm.
other? What's your thoughts on that when it comes to spiritual questions and evangelism?
Oh gosh, there's a good question, Sean. Right away, I think a lot depends on the context. But let's
That's
start with
fair.
the latter. The reason I think the latter is a good place to begin, to taking an interest, showing curiosity. Firstly, if we show curiosity, that's actually quite winsome when you show a curiosity in somebody else. And so
Hmm.
so I think if you are a curious person, great. If not, you can cultivate that. And actually, one thing I sometimes say to people, a great way to cultivate that in a very non-threatening way, look for opportunities in everyday life where you can ask questions and take an interest in somebody. So, for example, the next time you're in an Uber or something going somewhere, don't just sit in the back like a lemon. Get talking to the driver.
Hmm.
One question I use in Ubers all the time would be, hey, how long have you driven for Uber? Do you drive all the time? Often Uber drivers are doing it part time, right? And so then
Yeah.
you're into what do you do the rest of your time? And amazing things happen. I've been driven around by by law students. I had a Jewish rabbi driving me on one occasion,
Hmm.
and so and I got there just by taking a little interest in why you're driving a taxi. Um, Next time you pop into a sort of convenience store and buy your newspaper, whatever you're in there for, take an interest in the person behind the counter. How's their day going? If your conversation goes deeper, try and find out about someone's family, friends, what they're into. That will teach you the skill of being curious, and you haven't got into spiritual territory. You've just taught yourself to take an interest in people, and the more you take an interest in others, by the way,
Hmm.
they'll take an interest in you, and all kinds of things can
That's
happen.
so
So I would
true.
start there. Then, as you move across into that, when you're dealing with people who have a different belief system, worldview to you, Sean, whether it's another faith like a Muslim or someone who's an atheist, taking an interest in saying, suppose you bump into someone, you get talking, you find they're a Muslim. and you don't know much about Islam, saying to them, interesting, I don't know much about Islam. Tell me, what do you guys believe? And then just ask follow-up questions, and take an interest. Or if someone's a skeptic, why would you choose to identify as an atheist? I find it's quite an interesting question sometimes. Or what's your story to that? How did you get to that position? Can be interesting. And as you said, yeah, take an interest, ask questions, not to be hostile, not to be clever, but I'm a great believer. The more you know about the other person, the more you can connect when you share Christ into their story. But then, yes, if the objections come and there are sort of stumbling blocks between them and seeing Jesus clearly, I think the next use of questions that you alluded to there is you can use questions to begin deconstructing some of those things. And I think questions are far more powerful than arguments are in some ways, because if you make an assertion, people can critique it, or they can go away going, yeah, Sean said something was clever. I was 85% convinced, but 15% not so sure. If you ask questions, you can, another mutual friend of you and I, Greg Kokel, has that nice phrase, to put a stone in somebody's shoe.
That's right.
If they walk away from the conversation and there's a question you asked that niggles away at them, then that can be very powerful.
I love it. Let's walk into the specific questions that you ask. You have 4. They all
Yes.
start with W, in case you didn't recognize that, Andy.
Good, eh?
Just kidding. Obviously you did. Good, what do you call that? Not alliteration, acronym. I can't remember. That's not my
Alliterate.
language.
I think it is alliteration.
Is that what it is? Okay.
It's amazing alliteration, actually.
Well,
See what I did
let's
there?
start with it then. So the what starts with a W. What do you mean
Does.
by the what question?
Yeah. Well, by the way, one thing I think I make this joke badly in the book is that I have a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old in my house, so we are very used in my house to short words that begin with W and end with question marks. In fact, it was funny. We were last night at dinner. My daughter can ask questions for at Olympic level, and my 8-year-old son pipes up halfway through dinner to go, Katrina, he said to his sister, you've asked 34 questions in the last half hour. The boy had been counting. It's brilliant. So the what question. The first thing I'd say, by the way, none of these are original to me. So people listening going, I've heard variations on this. Some of this stuff goes back years. I mean, C.S. Lewis has a lot of this stuff going on. Others have played with this stuff. Randy Newman, Greg Kokel. What I've tried to do is popularize and make a lot of stuff accessible. So the what question is when you pick up on a particular word or something that someone has said, and you just take an interest in it. You ask them to unpack what they mean. So, a couple of examples. You're talking with a skeptical friend and they say there's no evidence that God exists, for example. That might daunt you a little bit, but a great response is to say, well, that's fascinating. You might say that. What do you mean by the word evidence? What do you mean by that word? What would count as evidence for you? Because that everybody, approaches this sort of differently. You've opened the conversation up rather than download here's my 55-minute lecture on the evidences for God that I learned from that podcast. Or again, that you've run screaming for the exits going, what do I do? You've dug a little bit deeper. So that can be helpful. Another example might be, you're talking to a Muslim friend and they say, well, we Muslims believe in God as well. And that's something a Muslim may say to you. And again, you might not know where to go there, but saying, hey, it's interesting. You talk about God there. What do you mean by God? What do Muslims mean by God? What do I understand by God? What is he like for you? And ask good questions. Your Muslim friend will, unpack a bit of what they understand about God. And you'll find, I won't spoil it for you now, you'll find there'll be some things that are similar to what we Christians believe and some things that are quite different. And now, of course, you can lean in on some of those things. You can say, well, that's interesting. Some of this we share in common, but there are also some differences. As a Christian, I believe that, and you're away. So the what question is just learning to listen for words that are passing through the conversation unquestioned. And when we question them, interesting things happen. One last example, because I know last time we spoke, I was interviewing you and talking about your amazing book on ethics. With all the big issues in our culture right now around sexuality, this phrase "love is love" gets thrown around in certain conversations. Just going, hey, that's interesting. What do you mean by love? That avoids you falling into a whole series of elephant traps around, some of the ways that you could engage with some of the controversial topics out there. But to start low key, okay, you've used the word love. What do you mean by that word? So yeah, the what question can be really helpful and open conversations up.
That's really helpful. I found that I've spent probably a good amount of time answering questions that people aren't really asking because I didn't clarify what they believe. Step
Very
number
good.
one. So it's really a step of clarification. Do you believe in evolution or not? What do you mean by evolution? I had a friend in conversation. He goes, "Man, Sean, you're really homophobic." And I said, "Okay, what do you mean by that? Help me understand." And he literally couldn't even define it. I was stunned. So the point was not to catch him, but just like,
Yeah.
okay, help me understand what you mean by this. Then maybe we can make some progress. So step number one, what, which comes from listening, wanting clarification. Your question number two is why. Tell me about that one.
Yes, the why question goes a little bit deeper, and that's based on something I said a few moments ago, right? That in conversations, Sean, sometimes if we're not careful, Christians can feel we end up having to do all the work. So we're the ones defending, why we believe in God, why we think the Bible is
Hmm.
reliable, why we think Jesus is who he claimed to be and rose from the dead. All this stuff, huge amount of work. Meanwhile, the person you're talking with is throwing out objections or challenges, and they're sort of getting a free pass. And so the why question, what you're doing is turning the tables slightly, to use that analogy of Jesus in the temple courts, and say, well, hang on a moment. So let's talk about some of the assumptions you brought into the conversation and think about why you might think that. So, for example, someone says to you something like, well, how can you be a Christian? We live in the age of science. Hasn't science disproved God? Before you leap in with your size 10s and try and answer that, whether you feel confident to or not, simply beginning with saying, well, that's a really interesting viewpoint. I've heard other people say this, but tell me, just out of interest, what's led you to that conclusion? Why do you think that? What are the reasons that you hold that position? You're immediately making the other person do some work in the conversation. And look, there's a very, very good possibility, not always, a very good possibility, that when you ask someone to give you the reasons for what they've just said, I don't know if you've had this experience too, Sean. I've often found the other person hasn't got any. What they've done is
Hmm.
they've listened to a YouTube video, or they've seen a tweet,
Hmm.
or so on and so forth. I first encountered this, years ago when I first ran across this, back in 2006, if you can think back that far. A now very famous book came out, The God Delusion, written
Hmm.
by Professor Richard Dawkins of Oxford University, just about 50 minutes up the road from where I'm sitting now.
Wow.
And that book was quite widespread, and I would run across skeptical friends who would say, "Aha, Andy, I knew there was nothing in this religion thing because, I've read Richard Dawkins." And it'd be very easy to be cowed by that. But I learned early on, if I would say, "Oh, okay, well, why do you think that? What is it that you've read in
Hmm.
Richard that you found persuasive? Can you summarize? Can you, because I, at this point hadn't read the book, can you give me the 30-second summary that you think is this amazing evidence that he has?" And I was quite surprised by people who, even though they were waving a book around, hadn't actually got anything. I think it gave them a kind of comfort that someone of Dawkins' stature had written that book. So all that to say, when we're faced with someone who's a skeptic who's raising questions, by all means, we need to be persuasive and be answering the questions our friends are asking. We may come to that in a moment. But do a little table turning first. Look for where they're asserting things or
Hmm.
assuming things, and gently ask what their reasons are. Not as a gotcha, by the way. That's crucial that we don't sit there
Good.
being
I
smug.
agree.
By going, okay. Um, by the way, one last tip here: you can sometimes meet people, just sometimes, who are quite loud. You and I can be quite loud, but we can meet people on the other side of the discussion who can do this. I remember my early days of engaging with Muslims on this. I would sometimes meet very loud and confident ones who it was could steamroller you if you weren't careful. And
Yeah.
one thing I found helpful was again bringing this question into bear and saying, look, I'll tell you what, rather than this turning into a very frustrating conversation, why don't you talk for 5 or 10 minutes about what's on your chest, and then I'm going to have 5 or 10 minutes
Okay.
in what's on my chest. And by the way,
Hmm.
feel free to ask me any questions that you want to as part of your 5 or 10 minutes. That's great. Just know that I will then do the same. And it can create a bit of space in those conversations where you might have someone who's quite loud and domineering to say, well, let's take it in turns. And as part of that turn taking, we can do a bit of challenge, but both sides doing some work here.
That's a great way to kind of lay the groundwork, so to speak. I love it. So, first step number one is what? Question number two is why. There's a proverb that says, the purposes in a man's heart are deep, and a person of wisdom draws it out. So, I often know that the why somebody believes
Mm.
something, they'll give us intellectual reasons, and that can be a piece of it. Oftentimes, there's a relational, an emotional, a social, a moral deeper why. And
Yes.
I want to get to that if I can. And that's not just true for skeptics, that's often true for Christians. And that
Yes.
comes through good question asking.
Oh, gee, absolutely. And by the way, as an aside on that, if people want to dig a bit deeper, because that is such a crucial point, one of the books that I reference very briefly in this book, there's a wonderful American psychologist called Jonathan Haidt, who I'm sure you're
Yeah.
kind of familiar with. John's fascinating, secular, but quite sympathetic, I think, to faith.
Mm-hmm.
His book, The Righteous Mind, he has this wonderful illustration in there of the way that we think we believe things for rational reasons, but
Mm,
actually it's often much more complicated. And he has the analogy of the rider and the elephant, and you have the elephant,
that's
which
right.
is emotions and social surroundings and peer pressure, and on top there's our rational mind, which is the rider, and the rider can influence the elephant, of course it can, but often the elephant will go wherever it wants to. And you're absolutely right. Christians are guilty of this. Atheists are guilty of this. That we
Hmm.
think that we hold our views for really good, solid reasons, but actually there's much more complexity going on. But the takeaway for Christians is he makes this point that particularly character and the way we engage with people can cause the other elephant to lean in and be sympathetic. So I have a little subheading in my book called "Be a Friendly Elephant for Jesus." In other words, that yes, our arguments can be helpful, but we're only addressing the rider. If we are kind, generous, take an interest in people, create space for them to express their views, then there's more chance that their elephant will lean in towards ours. Don't just think that we're brains on sticks.
I love it. Let's do the last two maybe a little bit more quickly. You did the what, did the why, you have wondering, and then
Yes.
whether. Tell me what those two mean and look like.
Yeah, let's talk particularly about the wandering one, Sean, because I
Okay.
think it's one of the most important ones and is often missed. So the why and the what assume that you're dealing with skeptics who have objections. Most of my friends these days, and probably many of yours, I suspect, are not anti. They're not hostile. They're just disinterested. They're the no religion crowd. They're perhaps spiritually open, but they're not interested in Christianity. It doesn't feature on their radar. So going in expecting them to have objections that you can play your what and why questions at ain't going to get you anywhere. The wondering question, though, picks up on the facts that even our most secular friends have things they are passionate about, things they care deeply about, that actually only make sense if God exists. This is well trodden ground. There are lots of books that cover these kind of topics. The most obvious one to me would be things like justice and human rights. If
Hmm.
we are just atoms and particles, human rights is a fairly nonsensical idea. And there are plenty of atheist philosophers who have made that very, very point. Arthur Leff in the
Hmm.
US, Luc Ferry, French philosopher, list goes on and on and on.
That's right.
And with the wandering question, what you're doing is you're looking for something that your friend expresses an interest in, and you're gently asking, hey, have you ever wondered why that matters to you? So I had a good friend of mine, John, who
Got it.
was just like this, raised in a Christian home, rejected it in his teens, wanted nothing to do with God whatsoever. Any conversation you tried, he would close down with a "I'm not interested," until I noticed the Amnesty International sticker on the back of his car. And the way in one day to that conversation was going, hey, John, what's that sticker doing there? And he talked about his passion for human rights. And I just asked questions for a while, like we talked about, showed an interest. And then as he's got all passionate about whatever the cause was he was campaigning for right now, I just gently said, hey, have you ever wondered why this matters to you? If we are just,
Hmm.
smartly evolved primates, who got lucky in the evolutionary lottery, why do these things matter? And he never thought about that question. And that sort of floored him. And we talked around it a bit. And that actually opened up
Interesting.
the opportunity for me in time to say, look, I wonder whether, and that's the other half of this pair of
Okay.
questions, Sean, whether the passion that you have for rights and justice just makes more sense if Christianity is true. And the
Wow.
trick there, by the way, if you immediately go for your worldview is incoherent, it doesn't stand up, you're living in contradiction, become a Christian, the barriers go up. The elephant will veer away because you've been objectionable.
Hmm.
If you learn to go, hey, I wonder whether the things that you care about most just seem to me to make more sense if Christianity is true. You're advancing the possibility and then you're
Hmm.
opening up the conversation. So the wandering is picking up on the things they care about and perhaps helping them wonder why they care about them, what the source of those things are, and the whether question. You're gently introducing the idea that whether there is a better explanation for these things than atheism.
That's such a good way to put it. As you were sharing that, I was thinking of a story of a friend of mine probably 15, 17 years ago. When I
Mm.
was teaching high school full time, he was an agnostic, invited him to come speak to my high school students and just have a dialogue about faith. And I don't know why, but at that point, the conversation shifted towards whether marijuana should be legal or not. And his answer was, I don't want the government coming into my home telling me how to live. And then it shifted towards the end of the conversation. He made a statement, something to the effect of, why wouldn't I want to believe in God? I'd love
Hmm.
to believe in God. And I said, I don't remember the words I used, but I said, I wonder if there's a connection here.
Hmm.
Maybe you didn't want their government coming in and telling you how to live in your home. God is the ultimate governor, and he wants to come in and tell you how to live. Is it possible that there's a connection here and this is some of your resistance? 3 times he's like, I don't even really get your point. No way. Years later,
Hmm.
he became a Christian and he said, that
Interesting.
planted a seed. And it was just me not trying to catch him, it was genuinely wondering. So
Hmm.
I not thought of it the way you're framing it here, but I really like that. It's not passive aggressive. It's just a genuine question, trying to make connections,
Hmm.
seeing if it sticks with somebody. So
Yeah,
that's
that's right.
that's great.
And the great thing is,
Uh,
Sean, with practice, by the way, there are so many areas you can do this. We won't go into the detail now, but we
mm,
talked about justice, beauty, and art are another one. I'm a big outdoors guy. I hike, I
mm,
climb. I found that such a conversation starter with people. Why are we drawn to natural beauty and to art and so on? And then, by the way, if you're watching this and you're the kind of person who's into movies, movies, TV shows, and so on, so often there are questions, there are assumptions, there are themes in art, movies, TV, music, whatever, that as a Christian you can learn to go, hey, I wonder if you've thought about, I'm a massive Tolkien fan. I mean, that's
mm,
such an opportunity because you can say to someone, I wonder why it is that we're drawn to a story that has sacrifice at the heart of it. I wonder why it is that the best stories are about good and evil, which, by the way, is almost a quote from Sam Gamgee, actually. But, there we are.
yeah, love it. Well, one last question for you.
Hmm.
I'm curious, and I wonder, Andy,
Very good. You
how
were listening,
you.
taking notes.
I've been listening. How you balance being in relationship with people that you care about with wanting to bring it to Jesus. Do you feel like in every conversation you've got to get it to
Hmm.
Jesus? How do you do that in a way because you said you
Yeah.
care about Jesus? This is something you believe brings eternal life. It matters to you without somebody going, you know what, Andy? Saw it coming. Knew it was coming around to Jesus.
Yes.
Are you okay walking away from a conversation and never pressing into Jesus? How do you kind of
Mm.
balance that with people?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things there briefly, Sean. First thing is, depends on the relationship, right?
Okay.
If it's a person that you're only going to see them once, you've got chatting to the barista at the coffee shop, it's not a town that you usually visit, you're there, perhaps visiting family, you won't see that
Hmm.
person again. You can maybe afford to, not be a jerk. I think that's a big message throughout this interview, but maybe press slightly harder because you won't see them again. And maybe it's actually a bit more important, actually, you
Hmm.
plant that stone in the shoe. So you can lean in a bit. If it's a family member, and this can sometimes be the trickiest, right? I have family members who are not Christians, and those are some of the hardest to navigate because you want to be clear, but you also absolutely, if every time your cousin sees you, you are literally doing the God thing on them. Sometimes badly. I would understand this. I told the story in the book of I was at an event once where a woman raised her hand and she said, I've been sending a Christian video to my sister every week for 2 years, and she's just written to me and asked me to stop. What should I do? And I said, well, the first thing you should do is stop. I can't believe it's taken 104 videos or whatever before she's finally had enough. I've visited this poor
Wow.
non-believer just every flipping week getting another thing. I was like,
Hmm.
so take an interest in them naturally, I think can help. So yeah, some conversations, then there'll be a God moment. Sometimes they won't. And by the way, this loops back to the start. Take the pressure off you. It's not about you. It's about the Holy Spirit. So pray harder into those conversations maybe and say, look, Lord, I want to be careful to do this right. Would you very obviously create moments where it's the right thing to do to say something? And would you help restrain me where the best thing to do if I'm sitting there
That's
watching
great.
the hockey with my brother who I see every week? Maybe it's just the best thing to do is just watch the hockey on this occasion and not actually do the God thing. But one thing I'd add two things very quickly I'd add. If we get it wrong, do you know the power of an apology can be really helpful, particularly in family conversations? If you think
Hmm.
you've messed it up, the power of saying to your friend, look, I'm really sorry. I know sometimes I come on a bit strong. It's because I care deeply about you. I love you. You're my friend, my family member. I love Jesus, and just sometimes I can overdo. I'm sorry if the other night at dinner I overdid it, and that saddens me because it upset you and it gives
That's
Jesus a bad
great.
name. That can be a real winner. Do it genuinely. Don't by the way, don't pretend. You have to actually be willing to be
Good.
vulnerable. That can cause things. And then last thing I would say, remember that in the story of most people who come to faith, multiple Christians are involved. Probably, most people's testimony involves various people. Mine involve my parents and youth leaders and all kinds of things. So it's not all about you in this one conversation. So what about as you pray into your friendships, going, Lord, could you just use me to move my friend, my family member, slightly along the scale? If A is a total pagan and Z is a new brother or sister in Christ, hey, maybe it's not my job to move them from A to Z. Maybe it's my job to move them from A to C, and somebody
Mm,
else is going to move them further. And realize that evangelism is a team sport in that sense.
mm.
And that can take the pressure off a little bit from you feeling you have to go so strong that you risk alienating somebody.
Andy, I love your book. If I were to write a book on this topic, I hope it would read and sound a lot like this. Not that I could write the book that you did, but I found myself saying, yes, oh, that makes sense, love it. Really, a lot of what you're saying is go into evangelism and spiritual conversations with the right heart. That's step number one. Be willing to listen, really care about people, and invite further conversation. It's not rocket science. Anybody can do that. All of us can do it better. So I've got a little bit of a confession to make here. When your book is on how to talk about Jesus without looking like an idiot. Well, here's a confession. At the beginning, you and I were doing a sound check, and I couldn't figure out why my sound was so low. I tried everything except literally just pulling my microphone over. That's
Oh,
all
look at
I
that.
needed to do to get better sound. So don't do the stupid idiot thing on YouTube that I just did. When it comes to evangelism, pick up a copy of Andy's book and he'll help you from making those costly mistakes and
At least you
not
pressed
doing it
record, Sean.
live. So
At
at
least you pressed
least,
record.
let me check. I think I did. No, we're good.
That would be
Hey,
funny.
Andy, love it. Hope people will pick up a copy before those click away. Make sure you hit subscribe. We've got a lot of other conversations coming up on some fascinating topics on science and on faith and on sexuality. You name it. If you've thought about studying apologetics, we would love to have you here with us at Biola. We have students literally around the world, some in the UK, some in Africa, some from different parts of Asia. Fully distanced program. We would love to train you and equip you in that fashion. And we also have a certificate program if you're not ready for a master's program and thought, I want someone to guide me through and just kind of help me learn the basics in apologetics. There's a very significant discount code below. So check that out. Andy, once again, appreciate it. Keep up the good work, my friend.
It's been a pleasure, Sean. Thanks for having me on.